Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm your host, Karan, and today I have the privilege of speaking with John Podesta, someone who has had an immensely impactful career in government. John Podesta is the founder and the chairman of the board of directors of the Center for American Progress. He served as senior advisor to President Joe Biden for clean energy innovation and implementation. John also served as counselor to President Barack Obama, where he was responsible for coordinating the administration's climate policy and initiatives. In 2008, he served as co-chair of President Obama's transition team. John previously served as the White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton. Today, we discuss his journey into energy and politics, inflection moments working with President Clinton, President Obama, and President Biden, how future administrations could structure energy and climate policy to make it more resilient, and so much more. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. And now, please enjoy my conversation with John Podesta. Hello, Mr. Podesta. It is amazing to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking the time. And I'm personally really inspired by your career at the center of U.S. politics, really, and also helping to shape energy policy. Would love to kick things off by somewhat starting at the beginning. What did you imagine yourself doing when you were just starting out? And looking back now, are you surprised at how your journey has unfolded?
I got involved with politics at a very young age. It was during the height of the Vietnam War, and I volunteered to work and then went on the national staff for Gene McCarthy's campaign. He was running against Lyndon Johnson on an anti-war platform. And I hadn't seen much of the country. That gave me an opportunity to really get around the country during the course of that campaign. But I got sort of the bug to think that elections mattered, politics mattered, the direction of the country was important. And I was still in college and I finished school but stayed engaged in electoral politics. I worked in a Senate campaign in 1970 with then a young law student at Yale named Bill Clinton. He and I sort of became friends forever. And I worked on the 72 campaign. That didn't work out either. And I ended up going to law school and sort of thought I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. I went to the Land and Natural Resources Division of the Justice Department, but I was kind of called back to policy and politics. So I ended up working in a policy-oriented job in the Carter administration doing national service, and then ended up on the Hill. Was on the Hill for a long time before Governor Clinton was elected president. And then I went to the White House day one and served with him ultimately as his chief of staff. And then again, really with great fortune and great honor, it was just an honor to do it. I got to come back with President Obama and then come back with President Biden.
What do you point to as some of the inflection moments?
Well, two things. One, looking back that far, there were dark moments in American history. I was working for Senator McCarthy, but I was in the campaign headquarters when Senator Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles during the campaign. I was on my college campus, but back and forth into the campaign when Martin Luther King was assassinated. The country was in great turmoil over both the war and civil rights. And we came out of it and we did some things. Wasn't always a straight line, but we made improvements. Now we're in another dark time, maybe one of the most challenging in my lifetime in terms of the kind of authoritarian nature of the current administration. I've never gotten too cynical. I always think that if you kind of work hard, you can get back going in the right direction. And my old boss, President Clinton, says we make a lot of mistakes along the way, but the American people almost always get it right at the end. This is just a long twilight before a better ending. So, from my perspective, it was kind of staying at it. And the other thing I would say, really, particularly to young people who I think are, a lot of the people who follow your podcast, be open to opportunity. Don't overthink your career. Don't plan that I have to do X before I can do Y or whatever. If an opportunity comes along, if it seems like it's going to be a fun thing to do, if you think you're going to get a lot out of the experience and learn something from it, take a flyer. go do it. It almost always works out.
So when you were working on these campaigns and then it didn't ultimately work out, like what was your mindset at the time?
It was usually where's the unemployment office? and and how am I going to survive for the next month or two? But yeah, after that, I just found something. Uh, like I said, I ended up going to Georgetown Law School after the McGovern campaign, and that was not only fortunate in terms of my a career experience, but I met my wife Mary there, and we had 3 kids, and they're all doing great, and adults, and they have kids. One, my oldest daughter has 2 kids, so I think you just don't give up. Be tenacious. If you think what you're doing is meaningful, believe in it, just go back to it and keep at it. So I've had great people that I've worked with, great bosses. I've got to work with 3 presidents, but I work with Senator Patrick Leahy from Vermont on Capitol Hill, Tom Daschle. That they're great people to work with, and I think we managed to accomplish some things. There were times where the other side was winning more than we were winning, but if you could stop bad things from happening, if you could make good things happen, if you could improve people's lives, if you could kind of keep focus on the fact, particularly in government service, what are you there for? Whose life are you trying to improve? How are you trying to improve it? Our decisions you're making is the work you're doing, making people's lives a little better, a little easier, giving people more opportunity, expanding the circle of opportunity in America. That's a pretty fulfilling journey.
Yeah, it seems like you're focused on what can you do, not necessarily what do you want to become in status or like in title. And also it seems like relationships were a pretty core part of a lot of your professional experiences. You mentioned having great bosses, also becoming good friends with Bill Clinton. So like, how do you view relationships as you reflect back on your career?
I think that those bonds, those friendships are kind of not just from a professional perspective, but from the web that you're building in terms of fulfillment is really critical. I encounter a lot of particularly young people who are always trying to networking so that they think that it's going to get them leverage someplace. I mean, good for them, but I think mostly it's about the depth of how you lead your life and what kind of tracks you leave with other people. I've never tried to plan out my career or think about what the track was. I've just, I think, seized opportunity. I work hard. I've worked hard. I'm kind of like failing at retirement again. So I think it's important to be and to recognize that you have to work hard to really make a difference. But I've never cared much about titles and whether my neighbors thought I should get a bigger parking space on the street. I still do my own shopping at the grocery store, and cook my own food and do all that stuff. So particularly again, if you're in the world of nonprofit advocacy, or you're organizing, or you're in government service, you see how much how hard people just work to get by. And if you could be helpful in making their experience a little bit better, it's really quite rewarding, I think, in the end of the day.
Well, thank you. Thank you for expanding on that. A few more questions on this start, just because I think it's super interesting to hear your perspective here. You mentioned some dark times and also like losing campaigns, and then I'm sure just throughout your career, you've navigated some tough challenges. During those periods, are there any like practices that help you get through those successfully and maintain that consistency and resilience that you were talking about?
One of the things that is actually important, I really started doing this when I was in the White House with President Clinton in the 90s, is stay fit. So I'm still running. I'm an old man. I gotten really slow, but I'm still, out there running and trying to pretend to be racing, uh, which I can do with people against the people my age. I'm still, like competitive for the over 75-year-old set. I think that's really important. And then, as I said, I think having a sense of what's the mission that you're off on. Is it just making money? Is it trying to improve your community or the country or the world? And do something that makes you happy. Perseverance into work is really important. But in addition, just kind of trying to stay fit and healthy, it's actually really important. Otherwise, the fatigue overwhelms you, I think.
Who's faster, you, President Clinton, or President Obama on the run?
Obama never was a runner.
Uh,
I'm
that's
sure he's
fair.
faster than I am. Clinton blew his knee out. So I was running, but I think I ran with him once, but then he blew his knee out and
You couldn't keep up.
he started working out.
Got it.
And that was quite an occasion because he was in Florida at an event and he was staying at Greg Norman's house, the golfer, and he tripped and wrecked his knee. And it was really a bad injury. But we had a week later to go to Helsinki after he had serious surgery on his knee to meet with President Yeltsin to try to secure an arms control deal. So having to travel and having to perform in a context in which you're just getting out of the hospital, being carted around in an ambulance to go to these meetings I was with him for that on that trip, was really something else that you could have the fortitude to be able to kind of overcome the pain and be able to perform in that setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Are there any examples of really tough situations that you recall that you point to as like that decision was a really impactful decision and it was, we're like back and forth on how to go about it and that come to mind? I'm sure there are probably a few just given the incredible nature of your experiences, but I'd love to just get a sense of like how you navigate those particular situations.
Yeah, they kind of wash over you because there's so many of them in the White House. Everything, just something happens every day. I always tell the story. I was there, and when people read newspapers, and before there was it wasn't before the internet, but it was pretty close to
I don't
before
think
the
our
internet.
listeners know what a
But
newspaper
people
is.
still read newspapers. Waking up to seeing the faces of two identically cloned sheep on the front page of the Washington Post and New York Times. Dolly, if I remember the sheep's name right. And I didn't know I was going to be then spending my next, kind of weeks and months working on cloning policy. But that's what you have to deal with. It just things come at you, and the national security incidents come at you pretty fast. I think the most difficult situation I've been in with presidents, both President Clinton, President Obama, where you need to use force, and when you know that the consequence of your decision, both putting people's lives at risk, but you're also going to be taking people's lives from the actions that you're taking. That's a somber responsibility, and somber responsibility for the advisors to the president of what the scope and context of those actions are. Those are probably the toughest things. Politics is, can get pretty frenzied and pretty heated. And we were constantly under investigation, et cetera. But I think it's the consequence of those decisions and the moments where you have to like decide, I'm going to go for it because it matters. Like President Obama's decision over the advice of some of his senior aides to keep going for as much as he could get on the Affordable Care Act to give people universal coverage in this country. That was a controversial thing. And there were people who were advising him, take a half a loaf, take a quarter of a loaf, take a slice of the bread. It's too hard to get this done. And I think from his perspective, he felt like look, I promise the American people are going to try to get this done. So let's just go for it. And it took, Senator Kennedy died. There were 60 votes in the Senate, then there were 59. It was a really complicated bunch of maneuvers to be able to get it passed. But he went big, got it done. And there are millions of people who benefited from that.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. Seriously, it's like incredible to listen to. And given that this is a energy focused podcast, I feel as if we should speak at least a little bit about your recent experience serving as the senior advisor to the president for clean energy innovation and implementation. Can you walk us through what that role involved and what you saw as your biggest priorities?
I worked very hard both in the run up to the 2020 campaign and then subsequently to encourage the then Vice President Biden, as he was running, to go big on climate, and then worked hard on what was originally called Build Back Better, the climate investment strategy that he put in. It passed. I was thinking, okay, I can ride off into the sunset. one of the many times I failed at retirement. And I got a call from Ron Clayton, he said, Chief of Staff, and I talked to the president about coming back to really run a team that was charged with working with all the federal agencies that had a piece of the action to implement the major investments in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that was my principal charge. I worked with the Climate Policy Office and the President's climate advisor, Ali Zaidi, broadly on climate policy. But my principal focus at that time was to make sure we got competitions for funds that were going to be dispersed by grant, that we got those grant proposals out and available to people, that the money was obligated. I think we did a very good job of getting that done. The current administration is trying to roll a lot of that back. It's all being litigated because generally money that's been obligated, that's consistent with the congressional enactment, is a contractual obligation from the United States to the grant recipient, but that'll play itself out in court. So we did that. There was a huge amount of the Inflation Reduction Act was built around support for private sector investment and innovation through the tax code. So this was a kind of massive tax reform bill, which required guidance across a range of 20 plus different tax credits for clean energy, clean manufacturing, clean transportation, et cetera. So my team worked very closely with the Treasury Department to coordinate the whole of the federal government to ensure that the clarity of that advice in the tax code was released and executed. And those investments were really paying off. The bill that passed this summer that President Trump signed rolls back a good deal of it. Some of it remains in place. And in the near term, the support for at least projects that can really get off the ground on renewables, particularly solar, remain intact. But they're trying to cut back as much as they can. But what that bill did, the fact that there was certainty in the advice, and what I think the private sector saw as a sort of durable approach, set off a boom in investment. There was nearly $800 billion of investment in clean energy related technologies, more than 400,000 jobs created. This is all before 2025, before President Trump took office. And tremendous amount of innovation in people investing in new, more efficient battery chemistries, new plants. We had the highest percentage of investment in manufacturing facilities in 50 years as a percentage of GDP in this country. So you had a booming sector. I wouldn't say it's just been completely killed, but it's certainly they're trying to throttle that back. And the result has been lots of jobs, lots of projects, cancellation of projects. And it's crazy to me because we're at a moment which is different than it's been in a generation, where you see a huge increase in demand for power, particularly for electric power as a result of data centers, artificial intelligence, electrification, transportation, and buildings. And they're taking off the table or trying to impede as much as they can the development of the cleanest, cheapest, most deployable sources of new generation. It's a hard turn to the past and to the special interests that have controlled energy policy in this country for a long time, particularly the fossil fuel industry. The president promised them at one point, sitting down with a bunch of oil executives, that if he gave him $1 billion to run his campaign, he would take care of them. And he certainly directed through executive order and otherwise his cabinet to do everything he can, including ordering coal plants that the operators want to shut down. He's ordered them to stay online, or the agencies have ordered them to stay online. So it's a remarkable reversal. Also has an effect more broadly on the economy. So we've seen job loss in the sector. We've seen job loss in manufacturing. Job growth is essentially stalled out in the country. The combination of the tariffs, other economic policies, has caused manufacturing to really, I think, stall at a time where we saw the U.S. again taking an affirmative lead in the development of these newer, cleaner technologies.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think you answered like 3 or 4 of my questions just in that one response. And firstly,
I'm sorry to be
to
long-winded.
say, no, it was great. It was great. And I think speak for a lot of us when we say, thankfully, you didn't tell Ron that you're trying to retire. You back. And like you said, creating all of those jobs, all of that investment was transformational for this sector just in the past couple of years. And I'm wondering from your vantage point, just given now how the current administration is attempting to roll back some of this investment and some of this policy, were there ways for future administrations that you feel could structure these policies slightly differently to make them more resilient to political change?
Let me begin by saying that I think that the U.S. perspective and President Biden's perspective that we can take on the climate crisis in a way that benefits the economy, that creates strong levels of investment, GDP growth, job growth, and do it in a way that builds on the prowess and the innovation capacity of the country. Harness our science agencies, invest in basic research, move forward with every tool that we have to create not just a more sustainable planet, but to create a more sustainable and a stronger economy. I think that was the central idea behind the president. The president was fond of saying, "When I hear climate, I hear jobs," and I think that commitment to investment, innovation, and integrating this into your overall economic policy has become the standard around the world. And I think at first it kind of it surprised people, and there was a question about whether you could get real emissions reductions through this process. It turns out you could do both. So what happened? We saw that strategy copied all around the world. In Japan, they passed GX, which is slightly different. It's looking at a little bit more in the future on technology, but definitely an investment-led strategy. In the EU, adopted the Green Industrial Deal, sort of spreading across. The Labour Party came into office in the UK with a whole new and bold plan to invest in clean energy to revive the economy that was burdened by Brexit. In developing world, you see this focus on trying to build out supply chains, not letting China dominate everything from critical minerals up to finished products. That's happening in India. It's happening in Brazil. It's happening. I just talked to a colleague who's at the Africa Climate Summit. It's happening all over Africa to try to build into essentially greening the economy in a way that's also just, equitable, and sustainable. And I think that central notion that this is at its core, an economic challenge, but the tremendous economic opportunity is the place we need to come back to. So you asked the question, can you make it more durable? Ultimately, I think one question is whether the congressional Republican Party. I've had different experiences with Republican governors who love the investment and want to see their jobs created and businesses come, and they just want to do more. Whether the Republican Congress can come to grips with the reality that climate change is happening, it's a serious threat to our health and well-being and to our security, and will find ways to cooperate. During the fight to repeal these provisions, there were a lot of Republicans who at least paid lip service to the fact that they liked the investments that were, majority of which were in Republican districts and states, and asked that they not be thrown out. And they got a little, maybe they had some effect. But the ideology of sort of climate denial, science denial, pro fossil fuel that the administration espoused won the day. And so, how do we come back to it? I think we come back with, again, with an investment led strategy. It wasn't that long ago where John McCain was proposing a cap and trade system. Mitt Romney, their 2012 Republican presidential candidate, implemented the Reggie in the first big cap and trade in Massachusetts. So it wasn't Arnold Schwarzenegger was active in California promoting a cleaner pathway and with success. So either they need to come back to it, or there has to be a kind of reckoning in where Democrats are able to convince the American public you got to stick with them for some period of time if we're going to deal with this stuff. But in the end of the day, this will be a choice coming from the American people and how they vote, assuming our democracy stands and they're able to vote.
On that point of the American public, I'm just curious as to what you feel is the reason for why some of this investment didn't actually translate into some communities, like a lot of the Republican districts, to buy in as much as one would expect.
Yeah, I think, there is a lag. It's just sort of natural. I mean, I look at the experience with the Affordable Care Act. Unlike the IRA, which remained, the underlying programs remained relatively popular, really across the political spectrum, the investments in clean, et cetera. The ACA was underwater when it passed, and it took a while for people to feel the benefits of it. And the difference was Obama had two terms, and it passed in 2010, and by 2017, when Trump came into office to try to repeal it, he couldn't do it because I think so many people were dependent on it. So there is something to the staying power of making these policies, embedding these policies in reality on the ground, telling a story about what will come, but also seeing the direct effects. I think we could have structured the program somewhat differently and maybe had more impact quicker was in the consumer facing programs, which were largely built around deployment through state programs. It's the way like LIHEAP, the low income energy assistance program. You give the money to the states, they set up a program. Federal government has to have criteria for that. Then State Department has to have criteria for that. Then the state government has to set up a system by which people can access the benefits of that, get their homes retrofitted, or get benefit of really zero cost home improvements that reduce their energy bills. I think we have to figure out a better model because, in the end of the day, I think one of the things that really burdened the administration and then burdened Vice President Harris in the campaign was the impact of inflation. You could talk around the fact that that it was COVID inspired. A lot of it had to do with supply chains, et cetera. But people felt that and they wanted relief from it. And I think there were programs that could have provided that relief. It's in the process of being repealed, were the home tax credits to get solar on rooftops, energy efficiency retrofits. That lasts until through this year, but then will be repealed. But I think we needed to get that going faster. You could tell them it was coming, but you needed to show them that was there for them. And some states are a little bit better than others at getting, New York got its program up and going pretty quickly, but that was just a long, cumbersome process. So I think if we had to do a redo, that would be a place I would look to get things going faster. Ezra Klein's got this book out on abundance. They're focused on permitting. I think it is true that there are permitting challenges. I think that subject, and I think we did a pretty good job of this, of political leadership demanding public participation, but due speed in getting the work done. So if you got people at the top who want to move things at the cabinet level, then things will move. And so we cut permitting time, for example, in offshore wind in half. Literally the first meeting I had with the cabinet secretary after I came back with Biden, this is in September of 2022, was with Secretary Granholm. And we were doing the long distance, we were looking at long distance transmission. What was it going to take to connect these renewables to the grid, et cetera? She had a list of projects that needed permitting. Top of the list was a project that I thought I had resolved in the Obama administration. 10 years later, it's still on the list. Well, that's like unacceptable. And it got fixed. It got permitted. I was at the groundbreaking for Sunzia, which takes wind power from eastern New Mexico to Phoenix and Los Angeles. But that takes like discipline and work and really the political leadership determined to not let things get stalled and bollocks down. Separate issues around litigation, but for the most part, if your mission is to get good things going, we got a little help from FERC towards the end. Could have used a little bit more. Congress could do a little bit better job in this space. But part of this is just keeping focused, keeping on schedule, being determined that where there's a glitch, you resolve it. And where there's a needed workaround, you work around it. Because sometimes there are serious issues that arise from, major projects in terms of environmental impact or impact on Native American communities. You just gotta get in there, you gotta work it through, and you gotta find a solution to it. And I think if you're determined to do it, permitting can be resolved. It's not just a question of the barnacles that have been built up over the years. It's a question of will to get things done.
Well, Mr. Podesta, John, thank you. This has been truly incredible conversation. I'm feeling super inspired just listening to you talk. I see that we're a couple minutes over. I feel like I could ask you a million more questions. I'd like to end on, I'll give you the choice. So I'm super curious about, just given that you've worked in politics for so many decades now and have a unique lens as a result, do you feel like this country has come a really far way in a positive direction? I mean, of course, there are like some areas where we might have gone back, some areas we might have moved forward, but like overall, how do you sort of view how things have developed? That's one option. Or another, like, just advice question for young people. Like, is there any piece of advice that you'd give to yourself, like way back when you were just getting started out?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about this over the longer sweep of history, particularly given the challenges that we're facing in the current environment, which is the movement on civil rights, on LGBTQ rights, on a range of support for people, the ability to really be who you are is just much more profound. It took a lot of work and a lot of organizing. And so I think you just got to remember that, stick with it. Although the country's gotten a lot wealthier, we've seen a lot of increase in inequality in the country over really kind of starting with Reagan, but it's been a long trajectory of more inequality, more of the wealth that is generating going to the very top. And that's fixable too. And I think, the country's still a great place, but it's going to really take a lot of work. And I think that the challenge that I guess my generation, even the next generation after that, that came before this generation, my children's generation, my grandchildren's generation, face is the structure of media is so different, and to some extent poisonous. So that is really that division that's driven by trying to drive people apart, get clicks and eyeballs, and that impact of social media makes just the challenge a little bit harder, more definitely harder, and it's going to take, I think, creativity to come through that. But the kind of work you're doing, I think, really helps in that regard. To listen, to talk, to interact, to be open to ideas from conservatives, but to stand your ground and fight for a better future.
Amazing. Well, thanks to people like you who are willing to share their incredible perspective and experience to people like me so we can learn from all of that knowledge and just learn how to navigate through these. And I think that long-term perspective, really appreciate that. And thank you again for this conversation. Really, truly grateful that you took the time to join the podcast. Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.